And with me here in the studios, Enrico Letta, who was the Prime Minister of Italy from 2013 to 2014, and who took part in the Brexit war games today mentioned in Gary's report. Welcome to you both on the programme. Let me start with you, Mr. Letta. You're on the record for saying that the vote should not take place this summer, as many people believe it might, because then the Brexit crowd would definitely win. Is that true, and why?
I think, as your TV is showing, the mix between refugee crisis and the referendum will be, I think, terrible, because the referendum is not about refugee. It's not about refugees. It's about, for instance, one of the topics that David Cameron is raising is about welfare benefits.
But you're saying the issues are getting confused.
The key problem is that about refugees today is another crisis, is a very deep crisis, and in these very days we are all trying to solve the crisis. But the problem is a British one, an Italian one, I would say a Turkish one, a Canadian one. So it is not linked to the European Union. The big risk, in my view, is to have as the, I don't know if you remember the Polish plumber in the French referendum in 2005. So another subject that will influence completely the referendum subject.
And your fear is that that subject will be foremost in people's minds because of all the pictures which we widely expect of people coming across the Aegean Sea in the summer.
Polls are saying that 10% of the voters are very much concerned about this topic and will change their vote if this topic will be the core of the referendum.
And you certainly will be better next year? Because the vote has to be held by 17.
I hope so, but I hope so for Europe as a whole, because if we don't solve the refugee crisis, it will be a problem for Italy too.
We'll get onto that in a minute. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, you heard the former Prime Minister of Italy talk there. So does that mean that you would be in favour of a vote in the summer because you'd be in a much better position to actually win it?
I'm happy for the vote to come whenever the Prime Minister decides to call it. He's busy trying to negotiate his terms at the moment, and I hope very much that he will succeed. For me, I don't think he's asking for enough to begin with, but I think whether there's a refugee crisis or not, the issue of immigration and control of our borders is the issue that concerns a huge number of the British people. It's not so much about the refugees. I think the British have always been and are welcoming to those in genuine need, and that will continue. The reality is that it is an issue about immigration is much bigger than the refugee crisis, and whenever that comes, until the British people that we feel that we have genuine control over our borders, they're not really going to be comfortable with continuing within the EU framework.
But you would admit, would you not, that there are two very different issues here. There's the refugee crisis, the people coming across the Mediterranean on boats seeking asylum, where Britain is not that affected compared to Germany or indeed Italy. And then there's internal migration within the EU. They're two entirely different issues.
Indeed they are, but I think the issue of the refugee crisis is now bringing on the question of an EU border force, asking British soldiers to go and defend Italian borders against refugee arrivals, those sorts of issues. That sort of thing is just absolutely not what I think anyone in Britain signed up for back in the 1970s, and I think most Britons today feel that that's not at all what our EU relationship should be.
Just very briefly, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, when you hear people like the former Prime Minister of Italy, Mr. Letta, coming over here, and all these other senior European politicians virtually pleading with Britain not to leave, does that leave your heart cold, or are you open to be wooed by them?
No, I think they come because they feel that Britain is a very key part of the EU and of what has been built up over 40 years. And I think I would like to see us maintain a good trading relationship and, you know, the good friendly relations that we've had for 1,000 years with our neighbours. But it doesn't have to be an EU federalising towards a single state.
All right, thank you very much for that. Mr. Letta, well, you heard it there. There's a huge amount of scepticism in this country. Is it not the case that if Britain were to leave the EU later this year or next year, given the very delicate state that Europe is in at the moment, it could be a devastating blow to the whole European project?
I think it will be a big problem. It will be a big crisis for Europe because the UK's contribution to the European competitiveness is decisive.
But that puts people like her and indeed Mr. Cameron in a very strong position, doesn't it?
But I'm sure that David Cameron's 4 points, famous letter, are very interesting points. They are very interesting for us too. So we would like to succeed in the negotiation to have a more competitive Europe, less red tape. My idea is that we need to go towards a two-circle Europe. Two-circle Europe means a larger Europe, where the UK is, without going to a further integration, sharing a single internal market, and a core Europe. The core Europe is the Euro countries with further integration. That could be the answer.
But the argument in most people's minds, and indeed in most capitals, is about something much bigger than that. It's about the survival of the European project when faced first with an economic crisis like Greece, and now with this moral, political, social crisis and the resurgence of populism. How do you deal with that?
But for instance, about refugees, the UK is out of Schengen. The problem of border control
No, but
is
I'm talking about the
control.
European project is in peril, is it not?
It is in peril because we didn't succeed in doing what is necessary to do. More competitive Europe. The Juncker plan has to be applied today, and we are in delay on that. We need to go and to have a big answer, common answer to the Syrian crisis altogether.
And everywhere you have populist movements coming to the fore.
But the populist movements are there because we have a too high unemployment rate.
Okay.
This is why we have to beat this unemployment rate. Germany, Italy, France, we are doing all we can. But I think it is necessary to know that some of these issues need to stay together. Right. Migrants, security, we need to stay together. Okay. Of course, we don't want a supranational power against all the nation states, but we want to be more